Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah ta'ala wa barakatuhu. You're watching the Dawah Bridge. In fact, it's a Dawah Bridge special. I have with me two guests, Brother Joseph Watfa and Professor Dan Juma. Today we'll be discussing the issue of black pilgrimage to Islam. Assalamu alaikum, brothers.
Alaikum salam.
Brother Joseph, it's been a long time coming. Also to the Professor, been a long time coming, but I'm very much looking forward to this conversation today. Very important conversation. And I know you've done some academic work in this field. I know that the Professor also has a great amount of material that he is able to recall. I've seen him speak publicly and, something to behold. But I think I want to start off by asking yourself, Brother Joseph, about the nature of your dissertation. In fact, before I get there, who is Joseph? Just to the public, a gentle introduction to yourself.
My name's Joseph Watfa. I'm a graduate from SOAS University, and then I did an MA in Lund University in Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote, as we'll get to, I wrote a thesis on black Muslim converts in London, looking at the reasons why and how they came to convert to Islam. And I've also taken part in other bits of research.
Okay.
So I'm looking at sort of mainly representations of socially marginalized groups and forms of resistance with this.
Very interesting stuff. Very interesting stuff.
Working in a human rights organization in London.
MashaAllah, MashaAllah. And yourself, Professor, I know that you are a historian and an anthropologist by profession. And I mean,
yes.
for your sins. What I'm interested in from finding out from yourself is, history is a very deeply studied subject from a number of angles. But in your opinion, why is history so important to study?
Well, history, I think, knowledge of history helps you to avoid making the same mistakes over and over again. That doesn't mean that humans heed the lessons of history, but as you know, he who ignores the lessons of history is doomed to repeat it. So I think history acts as a sort of an overview of the past from which you can glean where not to make mistakes. And I think that's why it's important to avoid making mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Indeed.
From the past.
Okay, so Brother Joseph, tell me something. What was the draw? Because there seems to be an overlap between the two subjects which you both deal with. I know that as I said, the Professor spoke at a recent event, Love Muhammad, and it was an African Caribbean unity summit for Islam. So there's an overlap in terms of the subject matter or the population to some degree that you were both addressed. What was the draw for yourself that drew you to that particular demographic as academic research?
I mean, I'd say primarily, sort of personally, growing up in North London, I grew up in a very multicultural area, mostly sort of African Caribbeans, Somalians, Turkish, Cypriots. And I saw Islam sort of grow. I mean, it's sort of best represented, I think, through the mosque in my area, Edmonton Islamic Centre. It was a one-room shack,
mm-hmm.
sort of 10, 15 years ago,
mm-hmm.
and now it's it owns a whole road, and the presence of Islam in the area has grown tremendously. And same for Tottenham. And growing up, I was seeing a lot of people that I knew, a lot of people I didn't know, people I just saw around, converting to Islam, people going from lives of I guess questionable sort of lives, doing things that maybe aren't the greatest things,
less than ideal,
less than ideal, leading less than ideal lives, converting to Islam, seeing this huge break sort of and change in personality. And I was noticing that, and I noticed it for quite a while, and then sort of, I guess you could say it started around 7/7 times. I mean, I was a kid at those times, but I mean, the sort of historical journey in my head when I came to this decision sort of started from then. It was looking at every time, the media represented converts, especially black converts, mm-hmm. there was a particular representation of them, and one which focused specifically on notions of radicalization, sort of the infantilization of sort of black converts, that, they were vulnerable, exploited,
mm-hmm.
If you were to sort of take away everything you read, and the truths you were to take away from sort of media discourses, whether it be on the news or in newspapers, on TV or in newspapers, would be that black males were being brainwashed into Islam, or doing it for reasons to commit terrorist acts. And so the sort of dissonance between those two the two phenomena, the one that I was seeing and the one that I was hearing about and reading about, sort of inspired me to, want to hear the stories of the converts for themselves. Very rarely do converts speak for themselves. Are they allowed to speak for themselves?
Interesting point. Sheikh, is this a narrative that you're familiar with, this misrepresentation, if I can put it like that, of African Caribbean Muslims that revert to Islam?
I go back a very long way. I do not start. The conversion of African Caribbeans to Islam does not start in the noughties, it doesn't start in the 90s, it doesn't start in the 80s, not even the 70s. It goes back as early as the 60s and arguably even before. So there have been a number of different emphases that were the stimuli for African Caribbeans or Africans of the diaspora in general becoming Muslim. And in each of these periods that I mentioned, the focus would have been different or slightly different. So there's not one reason, there are a number of reasons why blacks of the diaspora, I rather to lump them. I feel it's easier to lump them with people of the African American diaspora as well, in terms of how conversion came about, because my area of observation, a place like Trinidad and Tobago, where I was brought up, is a very good example of where you would find a large diaspora Muslim population that had a minimal effect on African Caribbean conversion until the influence of the African American, like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, on the African Caribbean diaspora.
Wow. So
that is why I'm trying to say, I think the experience of the African American and the African Caribbean diaspora, there are major similarities between them. And that's why I'm saying Africans of the diaspora.
Sure.
I'm putting them all together like
Sure.
that.
I just wanted to ask you if you could emphasize something or elaborate, should I say. You mentioned that there were almost indigenous Muslims in the Caribbean that did been there for some generations, but they had no effect on the growth amongst the African, or minimal.
I wouldn't say no effect. What you had from 1837 was the Asian immigration. When I say Asian, I'm referring to people from Afghanistan, Pakistan, which is today called Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and I think Assam, that area near to Myanmar. From that area, large numbers of people were brought to the Caribbean as indentured labor. The largest concentration of them were in places like Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname. Jamaica and St. Lucia as well. But the influence they had on the other people was minimal for a lot of reasons. They were minorities within larger minorities. The Indian immigrant was a minority in the Caribbean.
Okay.
And within because the bulk of them were Hindus. And Muslims only formed about a quarter of the population. Within the Muslim population, they were further subdivided into Shia and Sunni. So there were minorities within minorities. And to that extent, and being largely rural communities and very family oriented, the thing about the Indian immigration is that they came, the demographic was different from a lot of other immigrations. A large number of men and women came, so they were able to form almost hermetically sealed communities. They didn't need to interact much with the wider communities. And it is to that extent that Islam was not spread across to the African community. That is not to say that they themselves did not acknowledge when they arrived the presence of African Muslims in, say, Trinidad, for example. There is a road in the southern part of Trinidad where Indians settled called Mandingo Road. And the Indian Hindu term of insult for a Muslim, which was coined in Trinidad, is Madinga. And of course, it was a testimony to the fact that they saw Mandinka in Trinidad as Muslims as late as the 1900s. So even though there was that, the Indian Muslims attest to the presence when they arrived of African Muslims who were descendants of slaves and others as Muslims there was very little interaction between the two communities.
Interesting indeed. I hope we can go back to that in some more detail later on, but just wanted to bring yourself back in, Brother Joseph, and what I was interested in is finding out about materials for such a research, because it sounds so you know, at university when you're doing your dissertation, they say you need, you know, it's good to come up with something original. I mean, that sounds extremely original or extremely different. It doesn't sound like something that's been played out, and then you're gonna find journal and publications with, you know, replete with information. So how was the literature search?
I mean, in terms of looking at conversions to Islam in Britain, there's a few books, not so much, but you know, going on from sort of the 70s onwards, sort of in terms of publications, there was a few. In terms of black Muslim converts, the only sort of publications out recently, or actually out about Britain specifically, was by Richard Reddy. He's got a book called Black Muslims in Britain, 2009, that came out. I mean, his focus was more on sort of black sort of people leaving Christianity for Islam, and it was more of a socio-cultural study. But it did, you know, give me sort of a lot of information on. You know, it was a very extensive study. He had, I think, over 200, 300 interviewees. So it was extensive. It was from a more sort of Christian background, sort of influence in terms of he's been,
His perspective,
yeah, he's quite sort of involved in the Christian church. But still, you know, that doesn't take anything away from sort of the
absolutely.
book. It's a fantastic book. And so yeah, I mean, and part of what inspired me to, you know, want to sort of situate myself in this field was the absence of literature. It's, you know, the people generally, I mean, either it's not glamorous, maybe there's not funding for it in terms of the way we want to look at it. Most of sort of scholarship that tends to look at conversions these days is more in terms of small publications, and it's sort of in the security studies field, you know, treating individuals as threats, you know, and looking at radicalization as this, you know, transcendental sort of concept, which
almost in an antagonistic sense, or at least or the subjects are seen as antagonistic.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. They're seen as problems that need fixing, and so it situates itself in security studies the same way that, you know, a lot of literature about Muslims today is sort of situated in that field, counter-terrorism, and that's where, and that, I mean, if you just follow the money, and that's where the money sort of.
It's an interesting term. Yeah. I like that. So let me see if I can go a little bit deeper. You chose this area. Did you encounter in your own self any bias? Because, you know, you can find bias in the literature, but was you aware of any bias that you may have held before approaching the subject matter?
Certainly. I mean, firstly, I'm coming in from it as, you know, like situating myself in the study. I'm from London. I'm quite critical of, beforehand, quite critical of the representation of these individuals. And so I obviously have had a sort of agenda, which, I mean, to downplay that would be disingenuous on my behalf, because, you know, that's just who I am. I grew up in the area around these people. But then on the other hand, you know, I'm not African, I'm not Caribbean. And so, you know, to try and accurately represent these individuals would take, you know, being in someone else's shoes for a bit, and they would never, I mean, I could never, you know, fully accurately, you know, represent a black convert because I'm not a black convert.
Sure.
And yeah, I mean, in that sense, and so, and like, I guess like my general sort of critical nature, you know, I in terms of government policy and whatnot, that obviously influenced the way I perceived sort of the subjects and the study, and then also, as I think we'll get to later, but, you know, the focus of my study looked at, you know, a lot of the way police treated the subjects.
Also interaction with the authorities, right?
Interaction, yeah, with I say pastoral and disciplinary institutions, so schools, police, you know, councils, etc.
Okay, very, very, very intriguing. How was it for you to discover, or should I say, to, I guess, organize these ethnographic interviews? Because I'm thinking, like, there's a suspicion in the community, if I can use that term, the community, or amongst communities, right, regarding, you know, people researching or, you know, being the subject of suspicion already. So how was you received?
I mean, it was, I guess, like the first point, I think, which was in terms of sort of stepping back a bit, is the idea that you said initially, there is no one, you know, black Muslim community. It's such a, you know, dispersed community which situates itself inside other communities and is also itself several communities, if that makes sense. And so, you know, trying to situate myself initially early on, I guess that's another bias, is that I kind of had this idea that there was, you know, you could define, you know, black Muslims maybe, or black Muslim converts, and, you know, straight away straight away it was just like, yeah, you need to, you know, step back and go and reevaluate
because of the diversity.
There's such diversity, you know, such you know, different histories, you know, people converting, you know, interviewing a 45-year-old and a 21-year-old, and a 45-year-old who'd converted, you know, 25 years ago, and a 25-year-old who'd converted 3 years ago. I mean, you couldn't compare the two. The only thing, you know, that you could say about the two is that you know, their experience navigating, you know, the reality in British life was mediated by the fact that they were black, and you know, that's probably the only thing you could say.
It reminds me of the point that the professor made earlier on about saying, you know, back from the 50s to the 60s, to that, you know, each epoch having a type of different or different elements which influenced people to come to Islam. I'm aware of that phrase you used. You discovered like a collage of narratives, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. A bricolage of narratives. I mean, and that's what it is. And it's, you know, attempting to externally define a population by these, you know, these social categories we're told are, you know, quite unnatural. You know, black, white, you know, where, you know, all these different categories. But they're not, obviously. They're conjectural and they're contextual, right? You know, what. The notion black isn't this, you know, this long transcendental category. It's that, you know, it's African, it's Caribbean, it's within Africa. There's, you know, several different.
Wow. Yeah.
So to attempt, you know, you're at some point you're generalizing, and and that was great. But then I guess as an academic, and you know, in any academic study, you have to at some point, you know, try and create categories to sort of, otherwise.
Is it just to make it workable, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could. In terms of like, if you're focusing on specifics, you can only go so far without, you know, just basically saying that like everything and everyone is different, which doesn't really, I guess, like help the
overall outcome. Let me just bring the professor in for a minute. Brother Janjuma, you mentioned about the different epochs or the different eras and the different factors. So my original question would have been, so who is the African Caribbean revert, convert, or one who's come back to knowledge of self, to Islam? But I'd have to ask, instead of asking who is he or she, who are they?
Well, as Brother Joseph is saying, I mean, it's really hard to speak about people in isolation as this essentialized type, this monolith.
What about from time factors then? Sorry to jump, but what about from, like, if you could touch maybe on some of the factors that say, you know, in a particular era of the 50s, this was a dynamic, was it the Eastern philosophy influencing, or was it, you know?
In the 50s, there were individuals that I know personally who came to Islam, and they were affected by that period of nationalism in Africa. They were very much affected by the period of the Nkrumah period, the people like Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea, but they were also affected by the rise of the Nation of Islam. I think the Nation of Islam was seeing its greatest efflorescence spread in the 50s and 60s under Malcolm X's sort of management and leadership. The leadership, of course, was the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. But Malcolm X was the dynamic figure, the poster person, almost, if you will, that took that drove the movement forward and situated it within the context of protest politics, sometimes to the consternation of Elijah Muhammad himself. Who felt Malcolm X actually needed to be restrained somewhat. And it is that resonance with protest politics that I think a lot of black people on both sides of the Atlantic responded to in the 50s and the 60s. Yeah.
See, I've heard you mention about it being identified as he spoke to the politics of protest, but also of identity.
Identity, of course. I mean, the Nation of Islam itself was a movement that was a group of people in quest of an identity with the materials that they had at their disposal. They had a very sketchy relationship with the Quran because they had very limited access to the Quran, so they used what they had, the Bible and other things around them, and they sort of recognized in there things that show them that they were a different people, that this has been used against them. And it is to that extent that other people from Caribbean backgrounds sharing that similar biblical upbringing. Some gravitated to other protest movements like Rastafari. There was a period of what was called the period of Ethiopianism, when people saw Ethiopia as the only still as yet uncolonized part of Africa, and therefore salvation must come from there. And that ushered in a concept called Ethiopianism, where black people sort of likened themselves to Bani Israel, to the children of Israel, to the Hebrews in slavery once again. And then there's another group that branched off of that and said, well, let's take that a step further. Let's grow out of that, because that book has been used to actually enslave us, whereas the book of liberation is the Quran. So there was that sense of the Quran being a book of liberation, where the Bible, as people were quoting the book of Philemon, saying, "O slave, be, dutiful and return to your master." Apparently the book of Philemon was a letter written about a slave who was advised to go back and be patient and work for his master and tug his forelock and all the rest of it. Whereas the Quran was saying, fight against oppression, for it's worse than slaughter. So I think in the 50s and in the 60s, a lot of people who were looking for both an identity and a way of understanding why they were in this place, saw these two things come together: race, identity, and protest came together, and the Quran was seen as the book with which you can use to do that. Of course, there are contradictions with that. There were people who began to say, well, look, if you people claim to be the nation of Islam, then Islam as a religion cannot be said to be a nation. And what you're claiming to be is this black group of nation. So how do you negotiate that? And I mean, of course, the contradictions and the questions came on the death of Elijah Muhammad. His son Warithuddin tried to answer that by taking the movement into what he called the World Community of Islam in the West. And that happened in the 70s. So for a time they were called the Bilalians, still attempting to hold on to, like you said, this notion of identity with protest. And then later on, it became the World Community. So basically, Sunni Muslims.
That was my next question. Would you say at that point, Imam Warithuddin was making a move toward more of an orthodox or recognizable Islam that we recognize in the Middle East?
Yeah, and now that a catch-up needed to happen here, because what had taken place here is that on this side of the Atlantic, many of the black people who came to Islam came via the Nation of Islam and an offshoot called the Ansarullah Movement. This was, I think, based usually, a lot of the members were based in Brixton area. But the movement of the Ansarullah even took the Nation of Islam's notions of identity, race, consciousness a bit further by saying, not only are we people set apart, but we are in fact the children of, and this is a very funny thing they said, the children of Ismail, not the children of Israel. Because I was a member of the movement from a very early age, so I know these facts. I was a schoolboy when I was in secondary school when I joined the movement in the 70s. And Imam Isa was the head of it, and he claimed to have Sudanese ancestry, and which we later discovered was not true, because I am intimately connected to the family in the Sudan, whom he claimed to be related. And they disabused me of that. No sooner had I met them. But the most important thing I'm trying to say about is that the notion of race for the African Caribbean is a recurrent motif in the 60s, in the 70s, and in even a part of the 80s. It changed in the 80s. But if I give you a quick example of Trinidad, I think I'd better stop and I'll leave that for a bit later, because there's something anecdotal I want to say about not just race consciousness in this amorphous, all-inclusive concept of black, but I'm talking about connecting back to the continent of Africa itself. This came up in the 70s in a particularly curious way, and I'd like to explain it a bit later.
But let's backtrack a little bit, because I have this issue, in the sense, I say issue. I remember seeing the Ansarullah, maybe I was 20 years old, for example, in South London. I mean, they were some of the first people that actually talked to me about any type of Islam, showing me quotes from the Bible, but still tying it into monotheism and things of this nature. And I read much Nation of Islam literature, I read Malcolm X, watched the videotapes, the DVDs, not DVDs, actually in them days it was videos and audio tapes. So much information. Never became a member, but it had a profound influence on me looking toward Islam. Do you think those organizations, because of some of their idiosyncratic or unorthodox views, have been almost written out of, the attempts have been made to write them out of the African journey? Yes,
I can answer that even before you finish the question. Yes, there has been a deliberate attempt, but that ties back to your first question. Why do we learn history? And as I was about to say, history has to have a meta-narrative that is continuous. It has to pass from generation to generation. Otherwise, our people would not recognize themselves as a distinct ethnicity. It would be very difficult. And that is one of the problems that bedevils the African in the diaspora today, whether in Latin America, the United States, or in the UK, or in the Caribbean, for that matter. It's a problem because our people are so ashamed of who we were or what we have been reduced to, we hardly pass on anything to our children. This is not just in the Christian community, it has affected the Muslim community as well, to the extent that when some Muslims of Caribbean parents, born Muslims, are growing up in the community, they are confused, they are pulled by two different factors. Am I a Caribbean or West Indian, or am I a Muslim? Because they are being told by their Muslim friends of heritage communities that the most important thing they can be is a Muslim. At the same time, when they go to approach them for the purposes of marriage or what have you, they quickly disabuse of this notion that you have to be something else other than, you have to be something more. So when they go among their Caribbean friends and they say, well, look, I can't eat that because it's pork, the Caribbean friends with whom they should have something in common say, well, then you must be, you're different. So the Caribbean Muslim is pulled in these two directions.
Strained in two different...
Yes, he's pulled in these two, and he's confused by this. So some of them succumb to becoming invisible inside, the subsuming their
Africanity?
Africanity, the identity to the traditional, the heritage communities. Others, they just pull aside and they live isolated individual lives, as the brother is saying. And then you have, when you do an interview with them, each one is as different from the other as it's almost difficult to find any uniformity in their narrative to say, well, I'm trying to extrapolate from this what makes these people a collective.
A people. That is a very, very interesting, really powerful opening to the show from both brothers, and I'm looking forward to the part two with even more eager anticipation. I hope to see you on the other side of the break, but until then, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu.